to give you an idea of who we're speaking to today. Yina Jimenez, Suriel, is a curator and researcher with a master's degree in visual studies. She is associate editor of the magazine Contemporary and for Latin America and Caribbean, right? And so as a resident curator, she'll sort of set up the framework in how we're going to discuss notions of the Caribbean. Of course, next to Gina is Johanna Castillo, Marcelino is a connector, artist, textile designer, creative directress, whose work explores human connections, the divine feminine, the now, other worlds, portals, healthy circularities, repair, and sustainability from perspective of her lived experiences as a response to imposed realities. I kind of like that idea of imposed realities.
Right.
She received her BFA in fashion design at Altos de Chavon and Parsons in New York, where she specialized in materiality, focusing on textiles as a discursive element to create community from the individual to the collective. And of course, next to her we have Oneika Russell. Oneika attended the Namani College in Kingston, Jamaica, and she graduated the same year I did, 03, where she completed her diploma in painting, and in 03 she left for studies at Goldsmith College in London Centre, where at Goldsmith Oneika began to interrogate her deep interest in combining the practice of painting with new media. After which, she has completed a doctoral course in art at Kyoto
Seika. University.
University, Japan, concentrating on animation in contemporary art. She is currently a lecturer in fine arts and visual communications department at the Namani College. And last but not least, we have Camille Chedda, born in Manchester, Jamaica, and lives and works in Kingston, Jamaica. She graduated from the Namani College with honors diploma in painting and received an MFA in painting from the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. And of course, many of you already know these two artists on the panel. So I'm just going to open the discussion in talking about the idea of the Caribbean, and the idea of the Caribbean as concept. And so I'm going to hand over to our resident curator.
Well, thank you for the introduction. When we were thinking into the panel and what it is pertinent to discuss for the community, like in the Edna Manley College, but also for the context of Jamaica, one of the main things that I always like curious in relation to the Caribbean as a geographical space, it is the label in itself. For sure, that is a common thing and many current, many common through our history, let's say. But when I think into the Caribbean in conceptual terms, I always try to understand it is firstly conceptual. I mean, the Caribbean, it is mostly like a conceptual framework instead of a geographical aspect. And also how we can try to open up the Caribbean concept. Because when I travel to Haiti, there is an idea of the Caribbean. When I travel to Colombia, there is another perspective of the concept. And then when I went into Martinique or Guadeloupe, it is super different as well. And then now in Jamaica, there are many other ideas. So the thing is that how it is only through travel in the region that we are able to expand the ideas of the Caribbean, because also it's as an artist pretty close to me, Madeline Jimenez says, it was a label created by older people. So if we use the concept without really reflecting on it, then the people that created understood more than us about what we are, let's say. So yes, I think that could be an introduction.
And this is why I asked you, because I think your concepts around notions of the Caribbean as an idea, I'd like to hear further, how do you think language has changed those concepts, from region to region in the Caribbean? Do you think that language plays a part in how we think about it as concepts?
I think the language, the orality, it is important to approach the concept. Not necessarily the language, because when I say language, I am thinking into idiomas, specific idioms. So if we think in languages into orality in itself and expression in itself, then yes. But I prefer to refer into the orality, because our way of approaching our way to communicate our experience in this context, it is pretty linked to the geographical space. So even we are islands, or the Central America and the south of North America, which is the continental Caribbean, we share a lot of characteristics in terms of geographical aspects. It is not the same. I mean, if you go to here in Jamaica, I am looking into older living beings that are not necessarily present in Haiti or the DR. Or if you go to Colombia, so the reality is the way in which we are trying to translate our experience in this context to to materialize, let's say. And I think for sure every community in the region, we are shaping our idea of Caribbean through the orality.
And so as a curator, how do you then go about crafting concepts through artists of different regions in the Caribbean? How do you find the consistent thread in terms of how do you go about curating in a space complicated?
That is a super huge question, but I think the conscious of ephemeral, it is something that is consistent through our practice of aesthetic knowledge, and also the intention to traffic knowledge. Even traffic knowledge into the production of art in itself, but also how we can, through aesthetics tools, traffic knowledge into other parts of our societies, let's say. Tomorrow I will talk a little bit about both things, but yeah, the ephemeral consciousness instead of the temporal idea of establish something. I mean, instead of insisting in something that is fixed, the practices in the region are going into more ephemeral things. And I am not talking necessarily la durabilidad, like the durability of the artwork, but it is a way of working, a way of operating.
That, and the interesting thing about the artists on the panel, I thought, was that each artist seemed to use these almost disparate parts in assembling an artwork. It's sort of this bringing together of these parts to create a singular thing. And so I sort of wanted to move down the line to hear your experiences in how you thought about yourself as a Caribbean artist, and how you approach the way of making with that as a concept.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for the introduction. I want to also say thank you to Edna Manley, Ruby, Caribbean Caribbean Art Initiative, and who else? Everybody. Well, everybody. So yeah, how do I define myself as a? I feel like it's very interesting because I feel when I saw the question, I had 4 concepts that came to, and in thinking about my being a Caribbean. So the first one is I am the Caribbean. So the first one is I am the Caribbean moves with me. So when I think about me being the Caribbean, the way that I'm thinking about is like how the Caribbean is the things that I've lived throughout my lifetime in different spaces. And also it makes me think about the way that we start thinking about where we are when we go outside. So basically I use textiles as a way of expressing myself. And my work is very like site concept, it's very site specific. So I feel like it depends a lot on the context that I am in. So yes, I studied fashion design, but for example, in my work as a fashion designer, part of my main question was how to bring people together through fashion and art. And the idea was to kind of like bring what part of the problem within the fashion industry, which is the amount of waste that the industry creates, and also I wanted to also tackle the way that the supply chain dehumanizes and the way that society dehumanizes and overlooked certain communities. So it's like for me, it's like okay, how can I bring these 2 elements, like bring the element of like interactivity, exchange, but also like it responds to the materials that I find in the place. So for example, when responding with the I am the Caribbean, when I am, for example, in the Dominican Republic, we have a lot of secondhand clothing that comes usually from China, from the States, from Europe. So, just like in there, we already have like this mix of various elements, this mix of like not just clothing that is made to be disposable, but also like clothing that has already been lived by people. So I feel like in a way, we have this waste that is not just this thing that goes, but is also like an element that has memory, that have alive, that have, that has this series of like experiences that go with it, and then I continue on that circularity, right? So then that was one. Then the other idea that came was the Caribbean is everywhere. So when I think about, for example, the Caribbean is everywhere, it makes me also touch on the importance of the internet, and even like how, for example, social media is allowing us to have a different fluidity of information, constant information, being constantly like seeing so many things all the time, and I feel like in one way or the other that influences who I am as a person and what I create. And it's not just about like me being in a physical space, but also like that constant scrolling, stories. Even like when you, for example, choose to, like you have the campanita. How do you call that? Big bill. Yeah, you have like a little bill in social media and Instagram that you press that and then you get that. So it's I feel like it's also like the way that we choose to consume, right? Like like I feel like right now we also have like a lot of agency in the media, in the visuals, in the text that we consume as Caribbeans. So I don't know. I feel like it's I see that collage constantly, not just in the material terms, but also in even in the ways that I kind of like think about the formats. Because sometimes, yes, I use textiles, but then I like to think about textiles as just as we, for example, this was something that I was talking to the students the first day of the workshop. you know how we have language, right? How we have words.
That happens in order for this pull out of the figure. And we're going to move to you next, Oneika. So how do you feel about the idea of being a Caribbean artist, let's say? Not obviously not just in terms of the geographical sense, but as we've been discussing the more theoretical, ephemeral sense.
Okay, thank you for describing the work in the biennial so poetically. I think if you go back to, if you, you had the bios and you start with where we studied, and for me it's really important because you start off learning this craft, and of course you learn it in the context of Edna Manley College here, very national institution. So you're always learning about the Caribbean, but it's around, you are the core. And so I think many, many years after that moment when I was in school, I've had to learn that just as Gina is describing, it's almost like you build a paper structure of what your practice is, and then you kind of build on top, and then you take this away, because there's not, even though we have in Jamaica a firm sense of this is Jamaica, this is the Jamaican art history, and we have institutions that affirm that, the sense of the Caribbean is like a round, and we fit squarely in that. And so I feel like at the beginning there was a kind of confidence about, I'm a Jamaican artist in the Caribbean. But as my practice grew, and of course the very important thing, travel, connection, happened, I started to understand that everybody is seeing themselves in this way, like we're this isolation. And then everything else is around. Last night, I was talking to Gina, and she was describing a workshop that we did in Domrec called The History of the Mountains. And for the first time I understood, she was saying that the Caribbean is really these hills and valleys, of which there's a sea throughout. And we're all just living on like the peaks of these mountains. And I found that really interesting, because then it also knocks you down again. Like you're like, oh, I'm not really Jamaican, we're just these dots. But it's interesting because that's why moving image and video really appeal to me, because I feel like it's something that travels, it's timeless, and the economic reality of being an artist even locally and in the Caribbean is that you can carry something that is not really material. And so that definitely appealed as a way to capture story, capture idea, capture this sense that you are what you're exploring. And just to go back to that video that's in the biennial, I feel like that's like the last moment for me as an artist, which is, okay, at the beginning I'm trying to walk in the footsteps of like a Hope Brooks, or like, all these people that are in the national collection, but now it's like, okay, if we're all doing this, how can I use the space I have to connect in the way that Johanna is talking about to other people? So if I invite them into this immaterial thing that I'm doing, which is video, which is very easy and possible in that sense, and how can we collaborate as COVID taught us that we can collaborate, then we can have more of a sense of these islands or these tops of mountains kind of coming together at certain points. So it's a very vague answer, but I'm hoping that gives something.
I completely get what you're saying. Interestingly, the idea of the immaterial keeps coming up, but Camille's work is it's concretized in a kind of very specific way, even even though it's tackling some of the same sort of like assembling and the immateriality of or I'm using this specific material or I'm using that specific material, because she's also combining video with all of the things that she's doing, and so I'd like to hear more about how you go about thinking about these problems.
Yeah. So for me, I have been interested in a kind of personal identity, but also regional and Jamaican identity in the work that I do. So a lot of the pieces will have a kind of fragmentary nature, as you mentioned before, or an impermanence, even though I'm working with something like concrete, or before it was plastic bags, which I guess you can show the image before this one. So my practice is very multidisciplinary. So I'll work with painting, I'll work with installation, I'll work with video. And I guess it's a way for me to piece things together, piece parts of personal identity. Thinking about race and the aspects of value of human life. So the materials that I use, I found that they have such resonance in the Caribbean. For example, when I was doing the built-in obsolescence, which is the works using plastic bags, I was working on that in the US. Originally, I had wanted to use scandal bags, which is very local, very Jamaican. We call black plastic bags scandal bags. We don't have them in the country anymore legally. But when I was in Massachusetts, I just couldn't find any of these black plastic bags until I visited family in the Bronx and Brooklyn, and you'd see it, you kind of just see it everywhere, and it's like, it's such a Caribbean thing. And then the concrete blocks too, it's something you'll see in the Caribbean, this type of concrete block specifically. So I think there is a very local thing about the materials that I use. And in thinking about this panel, I was also trying to think, like, how did I know the Caribbean artists that I know of? Is it just because I came to Enamame and did some art history? How did I learn about other artists? And before social media was a thing, I realized that a lot of the artists that I became aware of after leaving Enamame was through them leaving the Caribbean and doing an exhibition overseas, and then getting access to like a catalog or something. But now that we have social media, using the internet, everybody has a kind of autonomy or like this kind of agency to access. Now I can learn about everybody's personal practice as they're doing it. So the sense of the Caribbean, I feel like we're a lot closer now because of social media, but at the same time, there's a distance because travel is so difficult. It's easier to probably go to the US than it is to go to Haiti. Like, you guys just came here and you had to fly to Turks and Caicos and then come here. I've been to Haiti too, and I had to go to Panama and back up, and we're so close, but we're so far away. But as I said, like this social media, I think has kind of brought us together, and then doing initiatives like, having you guys here through Impulse and Caribbean Arts Initiative. These are methods that we can use to kind of bring people together.
One interesting theme that I'm hearing consistently about not seeing ourselves sort of tied to the land in a sense. But oftentimes, and when you read a lot of external literature articles on Jamaican artists, something very interesting happens. They'll put American-born artist, Phillip, right? And this idea of a kind of almost separating, a kind of displacement, I was found very particular about how people outside of the region write about people within the Caribbean region. It's kind of, they're kind of ours now. And so that kind of separation, I've always been curious as to how do you artists feel about how you're viewed from the outside, yeah, as opposed to how you view yourselves from the inside. Do you understand?
Yeah, I think responding on that, the third line that I was gonna go is says the Caribbean is a word, and I'm relating it to the concept. And I wrote, it changes with my own process of identifying my. One of the things that I've been trying to address more and more and be more conscious about is also about writing. When I write something, so I used to be so abstract and formless, and it adapts very easily to different contexts. But then there's also what you say, like something is the work when you see it from the outside, and from the outside, and I'm talking about from any outside that we, right? But then when you are talking about your work, when you're talking about what you're feeling, when you're talking about, when you're writing about, even the words that we are going to be using are less, I think general, are also going to be more specific. And I think there's also something very important about that specificity of, you know, because then that gives each experience the richness of, like, you know, yes, we're all from the Caribbean, but then also when we come together, we can also like nurture all these different Caribbeans in from the different ways that we've been experiencing it. So.
Right, because Gina, for instance, when you curate an exhibition, you clearly think about whose eyes your curation is for. And sometimes that becomes a very complicated question in and of itself. How do you go about presenting works for specific audiences? So could you talk more about how you go about thinking about those things?
Well, many things. One is that I don't necessarily think into what specific eyes will experience the exhibition. I am more interested into, you know, the whole body, let's say, and the whole context of the people that will go into a project, into an exhibition project. Other thing is that I try to avoid always the idea of Caribbean art and Caribbean artists and Caribbean because it is an attempt, I think, to put as a whole package a lot of different experiences. And I prefer to you know, art may since a specific context, if you need a context, a geographical context, let's say. So yes, I always confío, I always trust into the autonomy of the people and the perception, the perceptual system of the human being and the human body to perceive certain really common, especially in the global, you know, and I mean, my curatorial approach, it is not necessarily to translate the art in itself into words, let's say. So I think the art has their own potential to talk with the people, and the curatorial, it is only like a way to accompany those processes.
It's interesting that you say somehow you don't necessarily think about how to package the idea of Caribbean art, and so you're sort of presenting this open project that anybody can respond to, right? But sometimes the reception of it, and for instance, I'm thinking specifically about Haitian art since the 80s, where for whatever reason it is, and if anybody somebody can jump in there. It happened in the works of the Haitian artists that created a specific way to make Haitian art. And I think that might be less about what was happening in Haiti and more about what was happening in where the works were being shipped. And so the audience almost sort of created a standard way in the production. And always when people say what audience is it for, because sometimes the audience creates the streamline in which a lot of artists function. Right? Oneika went to Japan, and I'm interested in hearing your experiences in being in this completely different space, and how has that affected you?
Okay. Definitely affected it, as it would. Demar, could you show number 8, retail practice, and number 13, exhibition, network building? So, before, I guess to answer that question, before going to Japan, I have to describe what I was doing, which was, I was trained as a painter. And of course, I was starting in video and trying to find my way with this thing I was fascinated with, animation as a way to bridge the painting with what I knew was maybe truer to me, which was a visual language that was not tied to an object per se. So it made sense at that point when I was looking for programs to go to Japan, because we all know of the anime that we associate with Japan. Of course, when I think about it, I think that's kind of a crazy choice, because I was totally not a fan of anime. So why would I go to? But I don't know, something drove me there, because looking at anime, which many of you probably have an experience or a feeling about, I can't describe it as anything but strange. Like it's the strangest art form, but it's also very beautiful because of that strangeness. So that told me, okay, I have to go to see. So I went, and of course it is that, plus the traditional, a country that is totally traditional and built on like this mountain of traditional arts and crafts, which was very different from Jamaica, because I knew that there was the narrative of us building this kind of cultural landscape, and it was new. And so they didn't have the anxiety of any kind of building of anything. They were just picking and choosing and felt free and confident to, if I want to make an animation in a box of crayons and put it on TV, that's totally fine. Whereas from Jamaica, where I felt like we had to almost prove that we had the technology, we had to use 3D technology, and like animation cannot be with a pencil and paper. So that was very freeing, and of course created problems in coming back, because I still have to contend with the idea that media art is not simple. It must be technological. So of course it shifted, but it's the practice now. Why I show this and the other one before is that the practice has evolved to this point where I'm going back to the paper and pencil that I remember that struck me of that experience of being in Japan, and what I was attracted to, which is that craft, that handcraft, which is really the essence of the creative impulse. But now this paper and pencil is printed on cards, and people use it. I don't have to draw. I'm asking them to also add to the artwork. So this is a workshop where there was storytelling, and so that is part of the thing that happened in going outside, coming inside, understanding what you could do more, Can you show them the exhibition images?
And in the meantime, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask.
Just want to respond to something that the young miss over this side said.
Yina.
It's a boundarylessness in terms of your art where you avoid the label Caribbean. I'm not sure why you would want to do that because, well, and I say I'm not sure why, but we have a million books, maybe quite a lot written on American art, same thing for European art, Chinese art, Japanese art, those things in those region, geography, as well as aesthetic practices. Well, I would think so. So why would you not want Caribbean as a category to say this is where you are located and this is where you work from in terms of the mental space, but the work is not limited to the sun and the sea. Why would you not want Caribbean?
Yeah, it is in relation, it is not only the Caribbean category, it is also the category of the American art, the European art, all the categories into the historical, into the art history, let's say, and the way in which we are trying to always put a lot of experiences in only one label, in only one category, and pretend to develop a certain conceptual framework to approach those practices.
But I don't think that's the problem of the arts. I think the problem of the art historians, those people who write and
Gina,
write reflexive practice.
Yeah, and I work as
stays as Caribbean. While when you read American art, it's part of the great Western tradition. But Caribbean art is part of the sun and the sea, and it never moved from the sun and the sea. So I think it's the art historian that do that damage. Not us should be afraid of that. Well, who's afraid of that? Not us should be afraid of that.
Yeah, but I work as a curator, you know, and I usually write as well. So I am trying to accompany the practices and put it in relation with older ideas and not necessarily through certain categories to talk about certain practices. So because of that, I always try to avoid because I know when I talk about the Caribbean from the Dominican Republic, it is pretty different from the experience that you have here.
But
You know,
unlike when you talk about Cuban art, it's kind of a different flavor though, because Cuban art, maybe by Wilfred and somebody else that seems to kind of the doorstep of at the back of Picasso, but at the doorstep of the broader European practice, which is, David Scott wrote an essay recently, it's somewhere, and I don't remember what it is, but he's kind of taking on some of those challenges, really from arguing against a critic of Smith. I don't know vice versa, but he's trying to look at how we frame art coming out of the Caribbean. Is it elsewhere, somewhere, or is it part of the Americas, part of Western art practices? What is it really? I think this should endorse the landscape, the political landscape, the geopolitical problems that we have, but pitch that in the broader context of 1492. As we were West before the West was West, or this part of the West was West.
but I hear what you're saying. There seems to be the debate on authenticity in that, for instance, if we take what is considered authentic Jamaican, it's kind of music and the film by extension. If you remove the labels, then it sort of frees up the ability to create. And so I think this is where the debate is occurring in that idea of
the labels, it is a strategy that this nation, this system of making, like this word system, has to really become transparent, the things that the human being does. So why we have to insist into the categories and into the labels? instead of trying to avoid and going into the opacity, which is a super important concept for the Caribbean experience in itself. Because if you who created the label? Who codified the label?
I would think it is the label per se that defines because if you look at the topography of Suriel art, you can practically tell by just that artwork where each work will appear. You know, if it's Chinese art, Chinese art, I'm talking like 15th, 16th, 17th century. See Japan, you see it in Africa, they see it in for every region, they have this characteristic geopolitical DNA printed on the work, which you can't get away from. Respond to something you say about Jamaica, I think, is an extraordinary case of something. I don't know. But I see work coming out of a region that doesn't subscribe to that parochial kind of a miasmic thing that we sometimes call art or culture. I think you see people like Phillip, in poetry, and that's the nature of music. But I mean, Dan Drummond was one exception that really look at Jamaica dynamism, but also look at the broader Caribbean as part of, with a respect to certain commonalities, and grow his craft still as Jamaican identity, but not the kind of crassness that we use to say this is what it is, but not development. So I am wary of that one, and I think the young miss is also wary of that one, but I'm looking at it from a broader conceptual framework. Cultural, geopolitical history, which I don't think everybody wants to come from.
Were you here earlier when I mentioned Haiti?
No.
Oh, you missed that. So one of the things I was saying about Haiti is that I couldn't figure out if the...
Oh, yes,
yeah. Right. So, because sometimes, and I understand your fear in that sometimes the intended audience sometimes drive the narrative, and sometimes if you get rid of the identifiable narrative, then you sort of open up the discussion to everyone. But I think what you're saying is that it is also important to have the, as I said, the DNA imprint of the people, to not lose that into...
But because I think that's a move in literature to people who write are writing in the native tongue and not writing in English. Even Garcia from Colombia, Caribbean, Colombia. He made a film once that he's only going to write in Spanish, and if everybody is allowed to translate that in another language. And today his book, Color, has been translated to 50 other different languages. Nuno Diaz from Dumbre wrote in a kind of national language. But his book been translated in other languages. I think there's a way in which you speak from your point of view, but it's still universal because Shakespeare is universal, but Shakespeare is particularly London, British, but it's still universal.
Yeah, and my thing is not about universalism. I don't think about that. I am not interested at all, and I don't trust even in that. It's a way in which we can go beyond the labels. I mean, for example, there is a show that I curated and is happening now in Sao Paulo, and there are a lot of people all over the place, and the show in itself collapsed the geographical things, and they are talking in relation to super strong things from different perspectives. And for sure, when you approach the artwork by Nadia Holdings, you will realize that people should be pretty in relation to the ocean to be able to produce that kind of artwork. So, and then you go and, Nadia is from Trinidad and she lives in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But then, together with Nadia, there is another artist from Los Angeles, from US. And you say like, okay, but this and this, you know, it is like the way in which you can set a particular framework to people approach the artwork, nothing to do with going universal or international artists, that I don't know what that means, which is a reaction as well to try to avoid the categories. But my thing is with the categories in itself. I mean, for what and for whom?
Could it be that it has a basis in some search for our identity still going on? There's a sort of basic insecurity with the terminology Caribbean because we really don't know who we are. I don't think, I mean, Omar mentioned other cultures like European and Chinese and Japanese. I don't think they would have been sitting here having a debate about that at all, the way that we are today. I think the debate about whether to use Caribbean or not has a basis in some lack of knowing who we really are. Who are we really?
And even
And that's what we need to define.
Yes, yes.
And then we can accept ourselves.
We'll take Dr. Pepe and then Kyle.
Well, just two comments. I mean, I think it is now very well recognized that prescriptive and confining labels are problematic and not very useful. But there is also still the fact that the Caribbean itself, less so the Caribbean diaspora, right now, is a zone of invisibility, right? And the label can also be a strategy, claim visibility, claim space in a particular context, right? So I wouldn't necessarily discourage the idea of a Caribbean cultural sphere too lightly, because I think there is tremendous strategic potential in that, right? And the second thing, I was just at the conference where the whole idea of the new art histories and the Caribbean was unpacked. One of the things that we discussed is that the new art histories and the new criticism can unpack and challenge labels as much as we want. They're constantly being reinscribed by the market and also by education at particular levels, particularly at secondary level, right? So there is, you mentioned Haiti, Michel Roll-Trudeau pointed out that history is not made by historians, and the same thing by art history. Art history is not just made by art historians, it is negotiated constantly between all these different forces that interpret, inscribe, and challenge, and so on. So I think the understanding what these forces is very important for this discussion, because that is where the hard labels continue to have significant currency. So I think that's really part of the problem that we need to look at. So anyway, just don't want to ramble.
Kyle?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Phillip, for mentioning the whole idea of the market and consumption, because that ties into the label that is made and how we understand the work and works from a particular geographic area. I wanted to ask, in terms of stepping outside of those labels, do we narrow it down, do we narrow our understanding to an individual's artistic practice and let that speak for itself rather than, kind of lumping it together under the label of Caribbean? So Mr. Rao mentioned Shakespeare, and Shakespeare, is European English, but he's also universal. But, aside from being universal, his work speaks for itself as its own kind of thing. So do we narrow it down to individual artists? But if we narrow it down to individual artists, how do we then, are we all just kind of by ourselves? How do we then kind of come together? And under what label do we come together? And finally, do we create, you mentioned the Caribbean as a label that was made for us. Do we create new labels? Do we create a new label that is not the Caribbean?
Probably known as Prince.
No, well, I think we have a lack of conceptual framework to approach our realities, and that will be pretty helpful if we are able to continue working and writing and producing any way of knowledge in relation to our realities. Then the necessity of those labels will be maybe disappear. And I think, instead of trying to, the label and the category beyond the arts, it is because of, it's an something, to capture something. So if we are fighting for freedom, if we are in emancipation processes, why we will insist into the labels, which is a strategy to become transparent something. And for becoming transparent, it is to cooptation, I don't know how to translate in English. But how to, okay, this is a bottle with a certain amount of liquid, which is water, and then I can work with this bottle in this way, because I became transparent, the bottle. So that is what I think, how we can go beyond the labels. It is first continue into the writing, into the research, into producing knowledge to approach our realities beyond the conceptual we have now, and also try to avoid the category not only into the arts, but as a strategy to make something transparent. And I am using the concept of transparent in relation to opacity of glissando.
That also makes me think about the connection between something when it's just based in theory. So when we just consume information that we, for example, maybe have not lived or have not experienced, how we think about, for example, a text in a way than when we think about something that we have experienced, that we have lived, that has been painful or joyful, so that makes me think about, the theory and words, but then also in contrast with the practice. And so I feel like in the process of practicing being the Caribbean, if we have to word it out, right? I feel like in that process of experiencing the land, experiencing each other, getting to know other Dominicans, Jamaicans, Martinicans, como que it also, as Gina mentioned, that constant process of, I guess, I wouldn't say redefining, but I think it would be opening possibilities to what the Caribbean could be, more than like having this, fixed form consumed as something that I literally just like read or that was written. But yeah, that can be in constant construction as well.
I think I want to present a kind of case. For me, there's this exhibition which I think can speak to both points because it provides an interest study, which is, I am an artist, and so in the Caribbean, I don't always get the luxury of just being an artist. If I want to see growth and change, which I think all of us here experience, everybody in this room. So one of the projects was, okay, once I understand I'm not just a Jamaican artist, I'm a Caribbean artist, there's that label. Okay, why do I put the label on? Why is it necessary? And what then can we do with that label? What I thought was, okay, the necessity is collectively we have a voice, collectively we have influenced metropolises all over the world. And let's choose one, New York. There is such a huge Caribbean voice in New York, and so many of the artists in institutions who are not labeled Caribbean in any way are a big part of the structure of that metropolis and the big art culture that we know. So one of the things we talked about with Petrina Dacus and Camille and several of the other artists was, could we tap into that label and make use of it for how we can do it? Because a lot of the Caribbean shows were based with using people who are based in that metropolis. Of course, there's a link to the Caribbean and an interest, but what would happen if I were to insert my voice coming directly from the Caribbean as an artist working here? And what would happen if I had 6 or 7 other artists coming along with me saying, this is my version, as Gina is describing. One from Haiti, one from Guyana, things that we don't get to understand normally. And what would happen if we put them all in a room and let's put the label, this is a Caribbean contemporary art show. What happens? It's pretty much received as the same as any other art show, so that no labeling actually happens, because you put it in New York, every show is like the same show, because it's a show in New York. But it is now something that people can start to hint at. Can you show the other one with the painting, Tessa's painting? Okay, so even that one. I mean, I don't think it's particularly Caribbean. It's, you know, a painting and a ceramic and another thing, but by the collectivity, there is some kind of notion that occurs, and out of it, like for me, that was like a bit of research that was very, for me, successful. Out of it, several other points of actions happened. So suddenly, okay, somebody says, oh, I didn't know that that's Caribbean art as well. Can you do a fellowship here? And so like Katrina was able to do another fellowship discussing this label and an artist who is under this label. So I don't know, it's a little bit of like wearing a mask and then like using the mask to achieve what you need in a way. It's a little bit of, we don't really subscribe to the mask or the label, but I use it because I can redefine it in a way. So that's what I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the same strategy. And you must use these things expediently. But the soup we use also to discard it. And in an amorphous title or term, just like artists, but we insist on being artists. But I like something this young lady in the middle said, so we should start defining ourselves out of our artists, which means like Caribbean can discard no one, artists can discard that too, since it's just a little bit. Likewise, when you define things of your own practice, that carries a certain kind of, it has really to do with germination in terms of our own development. And I do support that. I struggle with the term artist. In fact, I discarded, I formally.
Wait, you struggle with the term?
Artist.
Artist.
Yeah, I discard that. Yeah,
I mean, I struggle with it.
Yeah, I only use it conveniently.
What's the term you use now? Can you tell us?
What is your term?
Visual philosopher.
Oh. Okay.
It's kind of rough, but you know, some people might be. I was trying to look back at the history of when art became a useful term to describe a certain practices, and checking through from the Renaissance upward, all different artists, including Michelangelo, Leonardo, Da Vinci, always struggle with the same label in the work, not just talking, but in the work. You can see how the work are not to visual art tradition, but philosophical tradition. Right? So clearly people were struggling with that from that time. I start to look at those. So, but practice though is where you can formulate things that suit your best in terms of how you define the thing you practice and define where you locate within the thing you practice. So, art can go to hell. Art can go to hell.
Yes.
It's just the same.
Yes, I just want to say that there's value in both sides of this discussion, to a point where I think I have existed in between the two as well. And I think there's something you mentioned, Johanna mentioned about where we belong with each other, you know, how do you connect to people if you drop that label, you know? I think there's also a sense of fear about being stuck in that label. If somebody labels you a Caribbean artist or just a black artist or whatever, they kind kind of sit there and you say, well, what more is there to me? If you take that label away, what else can I do? Who else am I, you know? And it's something I experienced quite a lot in England about once you have this label of black, they put you in a box of what work they're expecting from you, which is usually trauma. It's usually about, you know, they want to see you cry or they want to see you angry or whatever. So I get that resistance to labels. I understand that, and I also understand that need for label and that yearning to be quite lonely if you feel like you can't connect to another artist. I think being an artist can sometimes be quite isolating, and when you know that there's somebody else that connects to your experience. So I think there's so much value in both perspectives to what we're talking about today, and I think in between that and can speak for both aspects. But this fear of only being seen as one thing, and I think as humans we desire to be understood. I think sometimes the worst feeling is being misunderstood by somebody, whether you're dating them or a job, you kind of don't want somebody to get the wrong impression of you. And if somebody labels you one thing, you say, no, but I'm more than that. Wait, you kind of hear me out, you know? And so I understand that. I think for me, the moment I started hearing certain labels myself, more there is my blackness as an identity, my Caribbeanness, my Englishness, or can I make work about a landscape, or about love, or about, you know, trees, whatever it might be. So I think there's sitting in between the two arguments as well.
But this is what I said earlier in a lot of literature. When you read about how people write about Caribbean artists, they always put Jamaican born. And it's, I always find it a very strange way of saying to the audience, this is one aspect of a thing, but, and so the Jamaican born thing is this additive, something more developed than just, and this is one of the things I've asked writers to say Jamaican artists, Phillip Thomas, I take off the Jamaican born. I've literally started people to argue about that because, I mean, to your point, I understand why you say that there's value in both things, but I think Jamaica has a very specific set of problems. I did a presentation not so long ago at the National Gallery, and I remember saying to Dexter that easily I export maybe 95% of my work.
What?
About 95% of what I make is exported from the country. Right? And so what are we doing if all our aesthetic resources cannot sit in the place they're in? I mean, that in a way is a kind of, when you think about, for instance, the Benin bronzes or anything like that, that was ripped from the culture. This taking from the space and putting in a new space is one aspect of force. But what if I set up the situation in such a way that you export it to me yourself? You know, and that is another way of thinking about how does art move through what we call the artwork, and who gets to own what, and where things are made, and why it's labeled. Well, this is from this place to get the authenticity. But we've had this added thing to it now. And so, yeah, I mean, to your point, I really like what you said about how am I weighing these two different points.
But you have agency in that though, you know, like you talk about exporting. As a living artist, don't we have agency in the way our art moves? And so we can interrupt those flows, even if it is based on a kind of path for an art career that is can we not interrupt at points the way it moves and how it moves, which maybe is what you're saying, but that exporting, that 90% export, could it not happen in different ways?
I guess what the desires are as such for so many people who are not in the so-called centers of the art. I don't even know how these centers are made to your point. The idea of how we create these labels, and sometimes the people that give us the label sit in these particular centers, and that creates a kind of a problem. But I'm not exactly sure how do we interrupt the way in which we move art through the art world. I'm not exactly sure how to address it. It's such a complicated thing that you asked me just now. Yours?
So for me, for example, even the way you can see my biography is written, right? I have Johanna Castillo is a connector, in parentheses, artist, textile designer, creative directrice. And for me, I feel like the labeling has always been a struggle because, yes, I studied fashion design, but for example, I specialized in materiality, so my final works were actually based on a question more than on the fixed idea of what fashion is. So I explore with, with ethnography, with interview, with making of a book, making of a system, making objects, then this performance. So I had this various elements that when I was doing it, it was like, oh, so is this art? So it was, for example, when I graduated, and people will be like, oh, what you study. And when I said, oh, fashion design, I'm a fashion designer, the question was like, oh, so when is the collection? So when is coming the collection? Are you going to be participating in Dominican Fashion Week? So for me, it was also that constant tension between the connotation that a label has and what you're supposed to do when you have this label. So then I was like, okay, I self-proclaimed myself an artist. And I was like, okay, now I'm going to be an artist. And then it was also like that same process. Like, now I'm doing, for example, I use this, do this reclaiming of clothing, which also connects more on the side of fashion, maybe not from the mass production, but more towards the side of like slowing down and sustainability. And I feel like from both perspectives, I've always feel like an outsider from the art world and also from the fashion. So, I feel like I've been embracing that in a way, that opacity, that unknown side of the labels. And then, for example, the creative directrice side connects more to the economy of the Dominican Republic. So, for example, when I was in the States, like I was able to like have the studio and pay the bills by being a freelance textile designer, right? But then when I came, it was kind of like, I had to understand the workplace from a different perspective, and what connected the field that connected more to that mix of fashion design and art was being a creative director in terms of like productions. So, so then I started to also adapt to the place that I was in. So, I don't know, what I'm trying to say is that I feel like, yes, I have those 3 fixed labels that come with my created label, and I feel like, when I call myself a connector, like a conectora, it speaks more to my soul's desires, to like my own ways of, I really enjoy like connecting dots constantly, and so I feel like that is also my way of like weaving and like sewing and it's not only the material side of like making a collage, but even through my stories, even when with meeting people and like, I don't know, I feel like I'm very interested in that whole, also that process of finding like common points, common ground. So on that note, actually, I'm going to show you a piece. You can go to the 1.6, which is called El Nuevo Mundo. No, actually, 1.6, no. Actually, go to the 1.1. So for example, this series of body of work called The New World, started in the backyard of a residency that I did in Oaxaca. And because I was trying to get textile waste, I was so used to finding textile waste in the U.S. But when I was in Oaxaca, like I was not necessarily finding that much because they have this process of weaving that is more, it's more of a slow way of making things. And I remember that when I was looking for waste, they were only giving me like little amounts of like yarn, and I was like, oh, so if you don't have waste, like what I'm gonna be working with. So in a way, what I actually did was to start thinking about the materials connected to their culture. So we got listones, which is part of it's part of like their feminine, I guess, culture in Mexico. And the piece didn't have any name. So when we actually started making this exchange, it was more of feeling the energy of the group, connecting with the land, connecting with the material, and then throughout that process of like, we had students from La Paz Montessori were asking me like, oh, so what should we do with, what should we call this? What is this? And I was just like opening the possibilities of like, well, this can be named as you want. And one student, he was the one that said, oh, this is going to be the new world. And I was like, yes, okay. And so I don't know, I feel like that was, I am very open to that, to using the present as a starting point to continue like, to opening like portals of whatever can continue coming throughout time. So then that was the first iteration. You can go to the second one. So then here you can see, and then I didn't have any plan to do it. It was just very, very intuitive. And then you can go to the next one. So then the second iteration of El Nuevo Mundo happened in upstate New York. And so basically this is a cultural center called Garner's Art Center. It used to be a textile mill, and they had a bunch of rolls of white fabric and that they were going to be throwing out. So they literally commissioned me, they commissioned me and they called me and they were like, Johanna, we have all this material, like what can we do? And so, it was also this new set of material that was going to be throwaway, a new context. And then I usually like to have questions in the space, so it's not just about the materiality and the connection, but also about generating new ways of thinking and new ways of like exchanging with each other. So for example, in this one, I had a cardboard with the question, what do you want in the new world? In a way to also think about, in terms of words, like, okay, what are the things that we want, that we might be missing from the world right now? And so then you can go to 1.6. Well, yeah, here you can see people connecting, and then the next one is, you can go to the next one. Yeah, then this was one was a little bit more advanced. And then you can go to the question, which is the 1.6. Go back, because I think it's, yeah. So then, for example, when I did the question there, what do you want in this new world? We had love and understanding, good music, yes, always, prosperity, understanding, for everyone to understand the term pro-choice, no fossil fuels, adventure, Green New Deal, honesty, empathy, and love. So then, the third iteration of that piece actually happened when I was in the middle of the pandemic as a story. So now you can go to the... and for me, I feel like the pandemic was a very critical moment because my practice has always been about, the in-person, the connection, the seeing each other, the feeling of each other. And not being able to be now was I felt like I didn't have a practice anymore. Like, okay, if I cannot connect, what I'm supposed to do. So I just did this question, and basically the question was, how do you imagine the new world / not normality? And the idea was that people could respond and also send like a reference. So it could be a documentary, it could be a book, and then you can go to the next one. And then, for example, one response was permaculture, and then what I do is that I start to kind of like research about permaculture, but then in a very kind of like digestible way, like short definitions of these words, and I ask the people that suggest to kind of like send a resource so that other people can also like, oh, I'm interested in permaculture. Well, let me look this author. So the next one is, for example, she sent me the permaculture promise. So yeah, I think this piece in one of those bodies of like deals a lot with the idea of adaptation, flexibility in terms of method and formats, and I guess, how would you say that? Yeah, different ways in terms of the context that it is in.
Any final questions? We're up on time. It's moving to 12. Council.
Yes. And thank you guys so much for the talk. One of the things with these artist talks, I like to mention it each time we have them, is that it's continuous dialogue. We seem to try to make a lot of points when you're at these kind of events, but it's really just to kind of continue the dialogue to see how we are interpreting these things, reinterpreting a lot of things. One of the things with as it relates to asking the question of what is art or who is the artist or Caribbean art or these different kind of questions. And Mr. Mentioning that he's a visual philosopher. It's really about us group, but still at a we continuously ask these questions about this practice we are so involved in, that we give so much time, that we think about, that is so much surrounding in our life and that our life surrounds it. How do we continue to understand this thing? So even us as creators, art practitioners, and even people that are invested in art, how do we come to grapple to understand why do we do this thing? So it might be about labels, it might be about you being a Jamaican artist, being an artist functioning in Jamaica, and just the same way the market, the galleries, does impact how made and does impact how one sees them as an artist. But it's all we have to understand if we are going to make our worthwhile, whichever practice you may be. So I'd like to commend us for this talk and just to continue the
That yeah, one final.
No, your question and what the person behind with the blue shirt mentioning, I prefer that kind of amphibious strategies, and amphibious for myself, it is not the ability to inhabit in two different worlds, but also the space in the middle, the ability to space in the transition time. Because currently we are living in transition times. So we are becoming from colonial way of managing the collective power, and then we became independent in the case of the English-speaking Caribbean, or in the a couple couple of years more going into that process, but the thing is that we are living in transition, and the labels, I think, is not necessarily the way in which we can really inhabit, but it is the amphibious strategy. So when I use certain thing and when I should avoid it. And at the same time, it is not a race in which we have to annihilate the difference. We have to annihilate the people like myself that think, no, I will try to avoid the label. It is, okay, how I can get into that perspective and also get into the other one, but at the same time, how we can contribute to really build, and for myself, that is a really important thing, not only for this part of the world, but for many, the global south, let's say, how we can really build knowledge, departing from our experience to approach the issues that we are having now. So yes, like I think it is how we can continue. It is using and everybody trying to find their own amphibious strategies, let's say.
And that is, you know, to that also makes me think about the embracing of the both and instead of the either or. So it's not just one or another idea, or one or the other definition of the Caribbean. Is embracing both and.
That's a really interesting point, that between both concrete existences, the space in the middle is to get from one to the other, a space that should be thought about carefully.
That is our,
Okay.
one last, like we compare ourselves to other very well developed landscapes like Asia. Like I don't think there's any way at all, because there's thousands of years. Like there's monarchy called way in between is the way we have to, and is going to be our way. It's going to be uncomfortable because it's new. But
all right. Thank you very much. Very happy to listen to our really beautiful points. Thank you so much.
I just want to thank
For having
the
us.
college beginning ourselves being in Phillip, thank you. Camille, thank you for this. And I also want to use the opportunity to welcome everyone that's here. And this is a first for me ever. I want to also acknowledge our new board chair, Ms. Peters, who's in the presence. Conversation. So tomorrow we will be having the lecture, and from Gina. Okay, Gina will be presenting tomorrow here at the same time, 12 o'clock. So out the other hand. And the conversation is not evolving, we're becoming, we're co-creating, and we look forward to coming in with Johanna. She's in the textile department and will be doing her residency here until 11. So you are welcome to come by for conversations with her students, the creative community. You're all welcome. So thank you for being here.